I was 22 years old when this occurred. I had just graduated college at the time. I was unemployed and scraping by taking odd jobs here and there around my little town, babysitting, cleaning houses, running errands, really anything for cash. One day, a woman I had dog sat for previously spoke up for me to a neighbor of hers, who was a friend of a man named Craig. He called me up one afternoon and told me that he would be away for a week and needed someone to stay in his home to take care of his golden retriever, Max. Craig said Max was a nervous dog who did best with someone actually staying overnight instead of just visiting to feed him. The amount of money he was paying was slightly more than normal, so I agreed to it. 2 days after that, I finally met Craig in person. He was a tall man in his late 40s, wearing wire-rim glasses and a windbreaker. There was nothing unusual about him, at first perhaps a bit too friendly, but not creepy. His house was on the outskirts of town, back in a stand of woods. The house itself was fine, a bit old-fashioned, with beige carpets and floral print curtains that seemed to have not been changed in years. Craig took me through it all: how to let Max out, where the spare key would be, what could be consumed from the fridge. He said I'd be sleeping in the guest room, directly off the living room on the first floor. I started the job on a Monday, and for the first 2 nights, everything was perfectly normal. I'd watch TV in the living room, take Max on his evening walks, and then fall asleep in the guest room with him curled up at the foot of the bed. But on the 3rd night, everything changed. I was lounging on the bed scrolling through my phone when I saw something strange. On the dresser in front of the bed, next to a tiny lamp, was a digital alarm clock. It looked innocuous at first glance, but it didn't quite fit into the rest of the room. The clock was newer, black sleek plastic with an annoyingly bright blue LED display, whereas everything else was stuck in early 2000s mode. There was something that made me take notice. As I moved closer, I saw that there was a tiny, perfectly circular black pinhole just above the numbers. I thought at first it was only a sensor, but then I noticed the angle. The pinhole was angled precisely at the bed. My gut plummeted. I had heard about hidden cameras that were disguised as alarm clocks, but I had never actually seen one before. My head began racing. I grasped it, and it was heavier than I thought it would be. I could hear a faint whirring noise within, like a small fan. I turned it so that it pointed toward me, and I looked into the pinhole directly. That was when Max, who had lain peacefully near the door, rolled over and started whining. Somewhere further in the house, not from the front door but deeper inside, I heard the unmistakable click of a door shutting. My entire body hair stood on end. Craig was not due back until Sunday. It was just Wednesday evening. I stayed stock still, clutching the clock in my hand, my heart beating so violently it was painful. Next was the creaking of slow steps on the carpeted hallway. I panicked, rapidly returning the clock to its resting place and hurrying to the door, locking it just in time as the steps paused outside. Then I heard Craig's voice. He was calm but slightly breathless, explaining that he had forgotten something the last time he was home and needed me to unlock the door. I couldn't even talk. The next moment, he said it wasn't what I imagined, that the clock was a motion sensor for the dog, and he hadn't wanted to scare me by telling me about it. I stepped back, my hand pressed over my mouth. He instructed me to come out so we could talk like adults, but when I didn't answer, his knocking escalated to pounding. His cool voice turned sharp and enraged. Max began to bark and jump up and down at the door, and it just made Craig madder. I looked in the direction of the window. It was low enough that I could climb out of it, but it was locked. My hands trembled so hard that it took me 3 attempts to open the latch. Behind me, Craig continued hammering on the door, now yelling that if I didn't let him in, he would go and get the spare key and call the police and report that I had broken into his place. I didn't give him another word. I pushed the window wide open, crawled out awkwardly, and landed on the grass outside. I was beating my heart with fear as I staggered away from the house. Max padded to the window, his claws snapping on the sill, but he didn't accompany me. I ran across the side yard and down the gravel drive until I hit the road. My phone was in my jacket pocket, and with shaking fingers I dialed my mom's number, who was just 15 minutes away. I instructed her to come pick me up right away. By the time I arrived, I was huddled behind a group of mailboxes, trembling, always looking back over my shoulder. Craig's house was no longer visible, but I couldn't help but think that he still had eyes on me. That evening, I slept at my mother's place. The following morning, I blocked Craig's number and then I called an attorney. The attorney informed me bluntly that without physical evidence such as a recording from the clock or the device itself, filing charges would be tough. Even if the clock was an embedded camera, Craig could simply say it was an innocent motion sensor, and without proof it would be my word against his. I wished I could have gone back and shot it, but my attorney insisted I not go back to the house by myself, and the mere thought of Craig's face repulsed me, so he did not get hurt. I was never paid for the 3 nights that I spent there. The woman who had introduced me to him then suddenly stopped answering my texts, and I never learned if she had any idea who he was. For weeks after that, I kept having nightmares about waking up to discover a camera lens staring at me from across the room. I began to check each clock, smoke detector, and picture frame in my apartment. I still wonder about that moment I looked into that tiny black lens and heard the door shut somewhere behind me, and what I believed was an empty house site made me wonder if he might have been in the house the entire time, spying on me through that camera. I booked the Airbnb in late September, a week before my girlfriend Emma and I planned to visit her sister in a small town about 3 hours away. I chose it because it was affordable, near her sister's home, well-reviewed, and seemed inviting in the photos on the listing. An older 2-story home with a porch that went around it, cheerful yellow lighting in the living room, hardwood floors that made it seem like a fairy tale, and one little mention in the description I didn't realize was important at the Tamiya statement that the basement storage room was not to be entered. I'd rented places where owners had locked off some areas. It's normal for hosts to have their personal belongings, so it hardly crossed my mind. But when we drove into the driveway around sunset on the first night, the property seemed more worn than in the pictures, and in front of it alone, except for one other house that I could see, with trees all around and a thin road, it made me hesitate. The host, Alan, was waiting on the porch before we'd even gotten out of the car. He was tall but slightly hunched, maybe in his late 50s, with thin gray hair combed neatly over his head and a perfectly pressed flannel tucked into his jeans. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his Aisa practice smile, almost Mr. Beast-like. His eyes lingered on us a little too long when we shook hands, and though his voice was friendly enough, there was a subtle firmness when he showed us around. He led us through a hallway smelling faintly of dust and something sweet, like candle wax, though I saw no candles. The living room had a big couch facing an old television. The kitchen looked clean but dated. Upstairs, the one bedroom contained a big bed covered by a ceiling fan and a little dresser and mirror. Then, next to the kitchen, Alan paused in front of a door with a large padlock and, using a firmer voice, informed us the door remained locked, his storage area, and there was no need for us to venture down there. He didn't smile this time. He merely indicated where additional towels were, told us to have a nice stay, and left. Once he was gone, Emma and I unpacked, made tea, and sat on the porch listening to crickets and rustling leaves. By bedtime the stillness was creepy, no cars, no far-off voices, just quiet. Later in the middle of the night, I believed I heard a muffled thud coming from downstairs. I stopped, listened, and attributed it to the settling of the house. The next day we were gone, but at 2 a.m. I stood stock still halfway up the stairs when I heard a scraping noise coming from the basement, like heavy weights being dragged across a dirty floor that began and ended. I initially thought that perhaps Alan had returned for something, but he'd informed us he would not be present. I whispered to Emma, and she also heard it. We slept for half an hour but it did not come back. It was worse the second night. At approximately 2:30 a.m. footsteps started 4 or 5 together, then a pause and 3 more pauses long enough that it sounded like whatever was below was paying attention. Emma whispered that she'd heard breathing interspersed in between the steps. We're there, frozen, wide-eyed, hoping not to make a sound. By the third morning, the house was oppressive. We still ventured out by day, but coming back was different, as if a weight had come to rest in the rooms. I opened the basement door during daylight. It remained locked, but I caught the scent of something faint and bad, the smell of stale, damp air with a sour tinge. That evening the sound started earlier, a clinking of metal, as if metal is hitting something hard, followed again by the footsteps repeatedly for almost an hour. The fourth night was when it was too much. When she was preparing to go to bed, Emma also halted brushing her hair and inquired whether the smoke detector on the ceiling above the bed seemed peculiar. From where I was standing on the bed, I looked closer and noticed a small, very circular black spot in the center that glowed differently from the plastic. I had a bad sensation. I took a chair, removed screws from the detector, and discovered a tiny battery-powered camera with a green light source within. Emma sat white and quiet while I combed the space and discovered another small lens protruding from a hole in the wall beside the dresser mirror, both pointed directly at the bed. That was all. We packed our belongings into our bags, left without having spoken to the host, and drove to the next gas station to make the police aware. 2 officers greeted us there. We introduced them to the noises, the cameras, and the padlocked basement. They accompanied us back to the house. The front door was not locked, and technically we were still entitled to be inside because we'd paid for 4 days. The police entered and took evidence, the cameras, the memory cards, and any other recording equipment they could find, and took our detailed statements. When we introduced them to the basement door, it was open wide but black as coal inside. We informed them that it had been locked and the host had been evasive regarding it. The officers descended to check, and within minutes we heard raised voices and noises. The situation became clear fast enough. They called us down, and to our horror Alan was hiding in one of the closets in the basement. Inside the closet was a monitor that appeared to be receiving footage from the basement. The police took the monitor and arrested Alan shortly afterwards. He was charged with criminal trespass and invasion of privacy. We didn't have to testify. The prosecutor received our statements from the police. I think Airbnb essentially bribed us with a voucher in the hope that we wouldn't post about our terrible experience. We accepted the voucher, of course, but that hasn't prevented us from warning. They've been rattled by this awful experience, Emma, and I still have the aftereffects with us. It's altered how we travel. We no longer trust rentals or Airbnbs and now only go to hotels where there's less uncertainty. My name is Joe, and it occurred about a week ago. I share a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate Eric. I did not know him prior to moving in. We met through a Facebook housing group. He seemed normal enough when he came to view the property, initially quiet, polite, and a bit awkward, but not adversely. That really worked out okay for me. I didn't want a best friend, I just wanted somebody responsible to chip in for rent and not destroy the apartment. For the initial few months it was okay. We had reverse schedules. I worked 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, he worked nights at a warehouse, so I hardly ever saw him. His door would normally be closed in the mornings when I was leaving, and he'd usually be out when I returned. We'd pass each other every few days and say a few words in the kitchen or the living room. It was ordinary, but it sufficed.
Then came the little things.
I arrived home late one evening to discover my closet door ajar, as I always leave it closed. I thought perhaps I'd left it that way. A couple of days later my desk chair was pulled in slightly towards the bed, which I never do. I dismissed those initially, but they gave me this odd sinking sensation, as if someone had been in my room. One Saturday morning when I was cleaning, I cleaned the shelves and began on the window and stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. On up in the corner where the ceiling met the wall was a tiny black spot. I figured it could be a hole or a screw, but when I approached, it was unmistakably a small wireless camera directed straight at my bed, held in place by a wad of adhesive and with a memory card slot that had no memory card. My hand trembled as I drew it down. I considered all the nights I slept in that room, dressed and undressed, even got intimate with women. The only one who had